Hey there, let's talk about having a weed-free farm. So I'm here to talk about weeds today, and if you're new to the channel, my name is Josh Satin. I'm the owner and farmer of Satin Hill Farm. We live on a 2-acre suburban lot in Raleigh, North Carolina. We have a market garden that's about 1/8 of an acre, and we're also doing pasture-raised chickens here. This channel is all about market gardening, farming, gardening, chickens, all that kind of cool stuff. And it's really geared towards everyone from the beginning gardener up through the small farmer. So if you're interested in this kind of stuff, please subscribe to the channel. There'll be a lot more of this stuff to come. All right, so can you have an actual weed-free farm? No, definitely not, but we can get as close as possible. And I'm gonna show you some of the things that I'm doing here and that you can apply to your garden or farm. You know, on Instagram and YouTube, it's probably the biggest question I get is, what do I do about my weeds? And there's a lot of things you can do, but a lot of it you have to be proactive about it, not reactive. And those are important things to keep in mind. And I really don't do that much weeding on my farm. And when you say weeding, you know, people think of sitting there pulling weeds and using a hoe and cultivating and that sort of thing. So let me show you a little bit about my beds. First of all, what is a weed? A weed is just a plant growing that you don't want to be growing. There's nothing in particular about a weed. It's, you know, it could be kale growing where you want lettuce growing. You know, it's just something that you don't want. So one of the biggest things I want to stress with you guys to begin with is the best way to prevent weeds is to prevent them, not to react to them. So if you can eliminate weeds before you even build beds or start planting or whatever, that is the best thing you could possibly do. Now, I always hear things like, oh, don't let your weeds go to seed. I'm thinking, man, if my weeds are big enough that they're starting to seed, like the beds are just done already. Like they're beyond recovering, in my opinion, in terms of keeping it weed free. You still might get a decent crop. It may not be something that you stress about or whatever, but you know, I won't want to see them that large. So that's just something I want to take care of beforehand. So when I prep my beds, I use the chickens to go through and eat all the grass and vegetation and stuff like that, and they clear it out. Now, there's a couple other ways you can do that. I haven't tried these, but you could use a silage tarp to cover them up, or landscape fabric, and I'm doing that right now to put a pause in some of my beds. But you could also use sheet mulching. I've heard of a lot of people, including some very awesome gardeners and farmers, use that technique to be really successful. So eliminate what you can, and then put down cardboard, maybe even 2 layers of cardboard if it's really bad, and then just put on lots of compost. And so the biggest thing to kill weeds in that regard is eliminating the light from them. All right, so I really believe that the biggest way to prevent weeds is to just eliminate them before you start planting, so using any of those 3 techniques. Now, let's talk about something else. Let's talk about tilling. And I'm not here to talk about all the pros and cons of tilling versus no tilling, but in terms of weeds, it makes a big difference in my opinion. Now, I don't till, so I don't have experience with that, but I see a lot of other farms that do till and they get a big weed flush. And if you think about it for a second, it makes a lot of sense. When you rototill and you invert the soil, you're bringing all those weed seeds up to the surface, and then they germinate and then they start growing. And so then you have a huge flush of weeds. I really don't have that problem because I don't till, so keep that in mind. Let's talk about mulch. A lot of gardeners will mulch their beds with wood chips or straw or hay or whatever they have around, which is totally cool. And I think that can be an effective strategy for some weed control. It will not eliminate your weeds in more long-term crops, but a lot of the crops I grow are high rotation, and so they get turned over pretty quickly. And so with that in mind, I add a lot of compost to my beds every time that I turn over the bed, and the compost actually kind of acts like a mulch. So, you know, I get a lot of discussion and seen videos about, you know, the back to Eden style gardening and, you know, just laying down wood chips and wood chips and wood chips. And, you know, in reality, it's kind of like this, but just we're using compost instead of mulch. So I don't know what the term is for it, maybe a deep mulch system or something like that. But, you know, laying down compost will help also suppress weeds because it will act as a mulch. I also get a lot of questions about wood chips or mulching the walkways, and I did a whole video about that, so check that out. It definitely helps, but if you have a weedy walkway and you just lay down wood chips, it's not going to kill the weeds. You know, the weeds are very persistent, especially, you know, places where, like for me in the south, like things just grow like crazy here. And so that's not going to stop it. You know, you probably have to lay like feet of mulch. I don't know the number. Some people say 8 or 10 inches, but you know, for me in my walkways, I really don't have any weeds in there, and that's because I eliminated them beforehand. And people go, "Whoa, don't you have to cultivate the walkways?" It's like, no, there's no weeds in the walkways. Some people will put down landscape fabric underneath their wood chips, stuff like that. I didn't have to do that. As I said before, eliminating the weeds ahead of time is your biggest battle. Planting your crops really close together can also help prevent weeds. A lot of people call this biointensive or biointensive market gardening. So with intensive spacings, once you get a stale seed bed and you plant your crops and they grow up, and what they basically do is create a canopy over the bed, and that will block sunlight from getting down to the ground, and that will also help prevent weeds from growing. So by planting your crops closer together, you create a canopy, block the light, it'll also help prevent weeds. Now you can go crazy and plant them too close, and then the plants will start competing with each other, and that's not good. So when you're rotating your beds and flipping them and turning them from one crop to the next, there's a lot of different ways to do that, and I did a video about that, and I'll post a link up there so you can check that out. But one of the things that I really find useful in preventing weeds is starting with a stale seed bed, and I use a flame weeder, and it is awesome. And you know, it's not going to burn up big weeds, but if there's just a couple of things that just germinated or some really small stuff, you can just hit it with the flame weeder. It doesn't hurt the soil if you just hit it quickly. And you know, you've seen some of my beds here and you see how clean they are, and I think that helps a lot in getting your plants to have a jump start over the weeds. Now let's talk about cultivation. I really don't cultivate that much, and partly the reason is I use a lot of high turnover crops, but you know, you can use, I really like the collinear hoe. You can also use a stirrup hoe, things like that, just to lightly agitate the surface to get rid of any thread stage weeds, but you really have to stay on top of it. Now with my like baby greens and that kind of stuff, like you don't even have a chance to weed. Like if you have a weedy bed, you're not gonna be able to grow that stuff because it's just gonna get mixed in. But stuff like this over here, like we got some squash over here, I'll probably come through and cultivate that once or twice before the plants get big, just to make sure that there's nothing going on the surface. But you know, even if something does come up, it's just a couple of weeds to pull. It's not a big deal. It's just when it gets overwhelming and then you can't keep up. So let's say you got it pretty much under control. You're you know, you're not getting a lot of weeds to grow, and you can do some light cultivation. But if you ever see weeds, just yank them when they're small, because once they get big, that's when it becomes a problem. They'll start spreading, and then you know, things can get worse from there. And you just got to stay on top of it. That's really the big thing. A lot of people ask me when their field is full of weeds and they're like, what do I do about weeds? It's like, well, you should have done stuff a long time ago. And I know that's hard to say, because if you're in that situation, I completely understand. It's a very tough situation to be in. When things get really weedy, it's sort of soul crushing, demoralizing. I don't know what the word is, but it's hard to look at it. It's like you feel bad for the plants. You know, there's a lot of work. You'll kind of just walk by it every day and say, oh, I'll get to that tomorrow. So it's not good to have weeds going. Another important benefit about not having weeds is that it really cuts down on your post-harvest time. Now, if you're doing a lot of baby greens or leafy stuff and you got weeds in there and you go through and harvest it, then you got all sorts of weeds in your product, and you got to get those out. So, you know, I found I save tons of time not having weeds when I go through and harvest things like baby kale, arugula, you know, sorrel, stuff like that I grow, and you know, not having to pick that out of the mix or product when you're doing your post-harvest is it's so important. So you're saving a lot of time in that regards too. All right, so for those of you who have a lot of weeds out there, what are you gonna do now? Well, you can go through and pick them out and hand cultivate, but the biggest thing I think is think about moving forwards. And if you have a bed that's just overwhelming, just tarp it, you know, and if you don't think you can get a good harvest out of it, just cut it down, tarp it, something like that. Or go through and pull everything out, flame weed it, add some compost. Just my recommendation, and everyone's context is different. You know, if you're in a bigger farm or you just have different equipment or whatever, I can't tell you what's gonna work for you, but what's been working for me is no tilling, adding lots of compost, and flame weeding when I do my bed flips. Those are the big things that have worked for me. So as I pointed out, there is no magic solution to make your weeds disappear. But these are some things that I think will be helpful for you guys, and things that I'm using on my farm, and strategies that have been successful for me. And you guys can see how my farm looks. I just really, and I'm not saying this to brag or anything, I really don't weed that much on my farm in a traditional sense. And for most people, weeding is like walking around pulling out weeds or cultivating or that sort of thing. All my weeding is done preemptively in how I prep my beds and stuff like that. So hope this was helpful, guys. And if you like this kind of stuff, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, share it with your friends, all that stuff. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one. Bigger thing on top of that, tiller or something, all right, let's, hey there, can you have a weed-free farm? Is that possible?